Assalamu alaikum dear students. Today's lecture is about environmental planning. We will talk about environmental policies and finally we will be concluding what is the procedures, how we actually will be implementing these policies which have been prepared. So this lecture is basically a concluding lecture which will be covering all the aspects starting from the policies, then plannings and then formulations. So first of all we will talk about means and scope of environmental planning. Anything about environmental planning is initiated by environmental policy. So what is environmental policy? First of all, we will just revise what is environmental policy. We have already studied it in our previous lectures. So, what is environmental policy and what is its need? An environmental policy may be defined as a statement of intentions and principles which provides a framework for action and for setting of environmental objectives and goals. So first of all, we will be having a policy, and based on that policy, we will be defining our framework and then different actions required to fulfill that framework. And for that, we will also be defining our objectives and goals. So it refers to the commitment of any organization. So it is not only for a country, but it's for an organization, for an institution, both. So uh, it refers to the commitment of an organization to laws, regulations, and other policies, mechanisms concerning environmental issues. Environmental laws are legal measures for conservation and protection of the environment and ecology. That laws lay down the rights and duties of citizens and public agencies in consonance with the global call for a healthy environment. So these are compatible with the overall goal of the healthy environment. What characteristics of policy are required? These should be authoritative, enforceable, flexible and adaptable, feasible, clear, transparent, consultative. So now you can have a better idea what policy ideas are. Often the starting place for the law. As we talked earlier, we need a policy first of all about any issue, and that issue is normally defined in terms of our environmental issue is expressed as a strategy. So we will be having a strategy for a particular environmental issue. So that strategy will be guiding our policy, and that policy is defining our scope, overall scope, what kind of things will be included, we need to do, what should be our framework, what should be our plan. All these things will be followed by that policy. So policy guideline is basically the setting up of our basic principles and guidelines based on which we will be planning a framework to deal with our environmental issues. So policy is a good place to start because policy can often precede law. Policies are found everywhere we go: institutions, market, industry, organization. Everything has its own policy. Market policies, school policies, educational policies. Uh, so everything is encountered in it, and they are often aspirational in nature and don't typically have legal implications if they are not followed. So it is only giving us a guideline, a overall principle scenario, but it is not having any implication. It is not a mandatory compulsion on any stakeholder to follow the policy. So for that implication, we need some laws which will be followed by the policies. Okay, so, as citizens, we must look around and see areas in our environment that we need to be improved by a policy. So, if you look around, we have a huge number of issues, environmental issues, which are existing, like uh, traffic noise, like traffic air pollution, like um industrial air pollution, smoke, fog, like wastewaters, like solid waste management. So everything must be first of all should have a policy. So what I talked earlier, it was that we the policies are used to describe the scope, what maximum we need to do at this moment to reduce the impact of that particular environmental issue. So we need to define a policy, and based on that policy, again, we will be forming a framework. We will be dealing with some planning of uh, some environmental planning to deal with that, and maybe we need some laws, we need some regulations. So all these things will be accompanied, uh, followed by the policy. So we can create mandates for the policy to be followed and implications if the policy is not followed. We can work on our district representatives and senators that if our policies are not followed, we can have some legislative cover to deal with all these kinds of issues, and so we need to talk. And the law is a policy written into legal language and passed by our elected officials. This is something about laws. Earlier we talked about policy, and now we will be dealing with the uh, uh, policy, with the laws. So laws are actually providing us a legal cover to our policy. They will be making it implemented. So this is the source how we can enforce our environmental policy. Simply, environmental policy does not have any powers. So, what is going to give and to empower our policy? It is the lawmaking. So, as citizens, we can engage in lawmaking process every by making sure our elected officials know where we stand on a particular issue. Grassroots advocates have often been known to influence the final outcome of law. So, being a citizen, we can engage in lawmaking by having our message conveyed to our elected officials, so that they should know our problems, environmental problems, particular environmental problems which are only existing in our area. For example, maybe there is a pond which is contaminated. So for example, maybe we have some drinking water issues, particularly to our related to our land, our site, our region. So all these things will be well known to our officials, our selected legal elected officials, and in that case they will be formulating some laws. For example, maybe they are making some laws to stop any kind of activity which is creating some environmental issue. So, followed by that, once a law has been passed, implementation of the law will be followed by the of the authorities, which will be empowered to implement these things. Another thing, similar phrase is regulation. A regulation is a rule within a law that specifies how the ideas of the law are actually going to be implemented. Regulations are vital to the implementation of the law because they will be kind of explanation of the procedures. It is kind of sequence of procedure, SOPs to be followed so as to implement the law. So every lawmaking authority obviously follows these regulations, which are in much more detail, which are more specific to the issue and describing in detail the procedures how the implementation of that law will be taking place. So this is something about the laws, and then now let's summarize all these things like what's policy, what is law, what is regulation. So think of a policy as the seed we plant, an idea that we have envisioned to improve our surroundings. So basically, policy is a seed, and the plant is actually what we will be growing. So the that seed grows the trunk of the tree, a law. Now that trunk of the tree is law with a firm foundation, and that foundation is actually our policy. Finally, from the law, we get branches of regulations, and that reach out into the community and assist with the growth of leaves or community improvements in our tree scenario. So, watering that tree and helping it grow and thrive can be considered as an essential part of our civic duties. It will be based on the continuous revision of our policy. We will be continuously improving our policy. We will be further improving our environment if we are having a revision of the policy. So, if we have a better seed in the form of a better policy, we will be having better trunk and better regulations, and thus the outcome will be much more improved form of the previous version. Now, one step ahead, moving from the policy to the planning. What is planning? It is actually the implementation procedure of that policy. So we need something to implement to in order to achieve our policy. In order to work out our policy, we need a planning, environmental planning. So what is environmental planning? It is not a single unit. It has different other components associated with it. What are those components? We have already studied. We will study them as well in the coming slides, but just for a brief introduction, it's planning, it's framework, it's law making, it's regulations making, and it's authorizing, it is implementing, and it's like um, giving some authority to other regulatory bodies. So all these things are basically the instruments of implementing a policy. So what is environmental planning? It is a part of policy implementation. So it is basically an instrument, it is basically a tool to implement our policy. So, environmental planning is the process of facilitating decision making to carry out land development. So, considering consideration given to the natural environment, social, political, and economic and governance factors, and provides a holistic framework to achieve sustainable outcomes. So, this is the process of which is called environmental planning. A major goal of environmental planning is to create a sustainable communities which aim to conserve and protect underdeveloped land. So, what are the elements of environmental planning? We are only talking about the planning, not other associated components which are required for policy implementation. So, these are some of the main elements of present environmental planning is social economic development, urban development, regional development, natural resource management and integrated land usage, infrastructure systems, governance framework. All these things are a part of the planning. When you will be planning, making a plan to combat some environmental issue, all these development, these points will be considered. These points will be the uh, roots of um, our plan, and these will be the base providing the basics. We will be all dealing with these components. So what is environmental management? So we talked about policy, we talked about planning, but here is something management. So management is another tool which will be used to achieve a policy. So an environmental management system is a framework. So framework is one of the components to achieve our policy. So it is association with the planning that helps an organization achieve its environmental goals through consistent review, evolution, improvement of environmental performance. So, all these things will be worked out if we have this setup, which is plan, and then which will be having establishment of the environmental objectives and processes, then do implementation process, then check monitoring and measuring and evaluating the process, analyzing whether the performance is satisfactory or not, then act. And that act is about make continual improvements. So that check will define whether the adopted procedures are satisfactory or not. If they are satisfactory, they will be continued, and if they are not satisfactory, they will be required a revision, which will be falling under the heading of the act. And then back to the plan if it needs some revision, and we will be again revising our objectives and the processes involved. And then we need some planning, which we need some implementation strategy, and then again we will be checking its performance, and then again its continual improvement will be evaluated, and then again this circle will continue. Now, what are the components of environment? You already know. Basically, we will be dealing with our earth surface, soil surface. We will be dealing with air, atmosphere, and we will be dealing major component of water as a hydrosphere, dealing with the life, humans and plants, all that are in biosphere. What is the significance of this? Our policies will be mainly dealing with this. But before going to the detail, let's recall that all these components of environment are interrelated. These are having a cyclic relationship. Everything which is existing in the environment is going to move from one phase to the other. So first of all, if a contaminant is released from a source, it is not going to be completely demolished. It is not possible to completely degrade. So it will be existing in one form or the other. That may be a solid phase, that may be an aqueous phase, that may be a gaseous phase, that may be a vaporous phase, but it will persist in the environment. However, this transformation can bring the changes in its toxicity levels. So as a result of that, that transformation, we can observe that the environmental issues has reduced to some extent. So that's why it is very important to understand the physical, chemical, and biological activities taking place once we are dealing with the policy, environmental policy. So we must understand the behavior, we must understand the cyclic position, cyclic scenarios of any kind of contaminant which we will be dealing. So then based on this, we need to have environmental protection activities, which will be again linked with our studies, previous studies on the physical, chemical, and biological response activities. So now, if you consider a carbon credit, this is another important aspect of our policies. So, that policy, environmental policy, is again having its different based on different strategies. For example, this policy is actually based on the strategy to deal with the uh, all those gases which are having their impact on the greenhouse gases. So, if you are aware of the phenomena of our global warming, it is directly linked with the greenhouse gases. Furthermore, if you are concerned about the ozone layer depletion, it is again linked with the greenhouse gases and their concentrations in our atmosphere. So based on that, we need to regulate them, and we have there are so many treaties which are existing and which are actually uh, developed in order to address these issues which are globally existing in our uh, world. So a global response, global initiatives are required in that case, because it is not a local issue, it is a global issue. So we need a global response on that, and we need international organizations to play their part. And in that case, uh, the international treaties are formulated and signed by the different responsible countries which are involved in this act, and which can play their role in reducing a particular environmental issue. So let's take an example of this carbon credit. It is actually one of the tools which were developed on the policy of the ozone layer rehabilitation. So, in order to rehabilitate the ozone layer to back to its original state, we need to reduce the emissions of greenhouses. And it was observed that CO2 was the major source of having global warming in the environment, and that's why CO2 was the major focus of this treaty. And then in this case, the carbon credit concept was introduced. What actually this carbon credit concept is, that it is you have to pay if you are exceeding a particular limit of emission which has been allowed to you by this treaty. So under this treaty, all the countries which were involved were given a specific amount, permission for a specific amount of release of the CO2. But if you are exceeding your limit, you have to pay for that excess. So if you have to pay in the form of carbon credit. Similarly, if you are reducing less than your targets, permissible limits, in that case you can sell your carbon credits, and you can earn money, and you can have business in uh, exchange to that credit. So this is the basic concept of carbon credit, and it was so let's have something more about it. A carbon credit is a tradable certificate. More specifically, it is a permit that gives the holder the right to emit over a certain period. So CO2 or other greenhouse gases. So carbon credit limits the emissions to 1 ton of carbon dioxide or mass of another greenhouse gas with a carbon dioxide equivalent responding to 1 ton of carbon dioxide. In other words, one carbon credit corresponds to 1 metric ton of CO2 prevented from entering the atmosphere. So, if uh, some country has reduced its emissions, then that case, in that case, it will be reducing the uh, uh, if the emissions are reduced. In that case, uh, the carbon credit will be in excess, and that carbon credit can be sold to other countries which are uh, mm, emitting the CO2 levels in addition to their permission. So, what is the origin of CO carbon credit? Were created as an answer to the need of controlling emissions, and to 2016 were about 36 billion metric tons, and an attempt to reduce the emission of greenhouse and harmful gases coming from industrial activity industries as power, steel, textile, fertilizer, etc., using all fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas that are the major responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. So, carbon credit system was officially formalized in the Kyoto Protocol, while the mechanism that regulates carbon credit was established in the Marrakesh Accord. So, who issues carbon credit? And again, Kyoto Protocol establishes the quotas for greenhouse gases, and then you can go through it. Who buys carbon credits? All obviously. Uh, Carbon credits are bought on volunteer basis by any country or company interested in lowering its carbon footprints. So, based on that, developing and industrialized countries are the two basic categories which were developed, and based on that, this buying and selling of carbon credit is regulated by a legal contract called ERPA, Emission Reduction Purchase Agreement. So, this was one of the components of our policies, like how we can implement our policy. Similarly, we have another uh, issue which need to have a policy, and that is forest management, sustainable forest management. So, as it is observed that the forests are suffering, being degraded, are degraded, and deforestation is very common. As a result of that, there is need of sustainable forest management. So, it is worldwide accepted, and we have a mechanism to follow that. And if you can observe here that first of all we need um, a seedling grown uh, in greenhouses, and then those plants will be uh, transplanted from the greenhouses where they have been grown from seeds, and then they will be getting younger, and then they will have an age of about 10 years, and then at that time there will be it will be required to thin out the forest for a better production, and that allows the remaining trees to make more progress. And then after 25 years, uh, the trees are almost ready for felling, and then once the tree fells, and then it need to be shifted and should be replaced by another uh, stock of the seedlings transplanted from the greenhouses. So this is kind of cycle which is uh, going to develop a sustainable forest management, which is very common in other countries, and it needs to be implemented if we need to address our deforestation issues. So deforestation is one of the issues, and we need to have a policy. So that policy needs sustainable management, and that sustainable management needs some environmental plannings about this issue. So that's how we proceed forward. We have some environmental issues. If we go back into the history, there are some very big disasters related to environment. And for example, Chernobyl disaster in 1986, Minamata incident in 1950s, and then 1952 London smog disaster. Please go through these incidents and search them out and learn about them. And there are some other issues as well which are globally known because of their severity and their hazardous effects. So please go through and explore more environmental issues which need management and planning. Now, some internal schemes for environmental management, how we can have a proper management system. It normally has an identification of objectives and define problems, determination of appropriate action, and then implementation and progress evaluation, monitoring and adjust management, future environmental management, planning. So this is the same thing which we earlier talked while talking about environmental planning. We had four steps in that, and it is almost the same steps which are expressed here. So it's all about the same thing, but we need a looping of this cycle, because we continuously need to improve as a continual improvement, and that continual improvement is actually based on the uh, check, and that check is in the form of monitoring and evaluation. And that monitoring and evaluation will define whether our previous policies are satisfactory or they need some modification. And if they need modification, we need to revisit our policy and their objectives and then targets, and again we will revise our planning, environmental planning. So we have another environmental aspect which we need to have a policy, which we need to have a framework, which we need to have environmental planning, and that is about the green buildings. It is one of the concepts which is important regarding our construction industry, and specifically there is a need of sustainable construction nowadays, with least usage of uh, artificial means to contain to keep its temperature normal and to keep the other requirements within the meat. So green or sustainable buildings is the practice of creating healthier and more resource efficient models of construction, renovation, operation, maintenance, and demolition. Construction reduce the amount of waste generated as a construction at a construction site. Design is building design detail will help to reduce construction materials and energy water requirements when completed. Material selection, careful selection of construction, uh, reduce, reuse, and recycle the waste. So all these components will lead to a sustainable construction, greenhouse construction, greenhouse buildings, all these things. So these are the points which are required. These are the parts of a planning. We need to have a planning in this regard. So uh, While talking about the management systems, let's have a look at the environmental management system and its significance. So, federal compliance, and then public health, and then emergency plans, all these things are included in the environmental management system. So, federal compliance, establishing an environmental management system, ensures that the organizations maintain obedience with federal environmental regulations, include the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and the Toxic Substance Control Act. Public health is protecting public health and safety. We have already some rules and regulations about these things which must be incorporated while defining our environmental management system. EMS, emergency plans must be established based on the rules and regulations as provided in the Act 1997, and it will lead to the EMS. Environmental manager duties. Of course, uh, all the things which we have all earlier talked are a part of the duty of the environmental managers. So they will be responsible for having sustainable development, and develop and implement environmental strategies, action plans to ensure sustainable development. This is the simple and straightforward uh, duty of the environmental managers. Lead the implementation of environmental policies and practices. So once they have been developed, it must be led by the same environmental manager to be implemented. Communicate with the relevant bodies for the implementation. Carry out impact assessment to check, identify the impact and environmental risks, and then promote and raise awareness at all levels of an organization of the impact of emerging environmental issues, and then implement best practices in areas of corporate ethical and social responsibility, and address any issues arising, coordinate public hearing and consultations on environmental matters, manage relations with the board of directors, senior management, and internal staff, train staff at all levels on environmental issues, participate in environmental education and research. All these are the responsibilities of environmental managers. Then we have global initiatives. So, how we need to address a global issue? We earlier gave an example of global warming and what are the measures taken on a global level. So, similarly, our main focus is the environmental sustainability as we talked earlier. So, we need to shift to the renewable resources. We need to focus on health and protect health of the ecosystems. We need to avoid excess pollution. So that's another uh, component of sustainable development. We are actually trying to reduce the load of pollution in our systems, in our environmental systems, because pollution is going to sustain in the environment in one form or the other even after the degradation. So that transformation is not going to work out unless we are actually reducing the load on the system, environmental system. So we need to find out the modes which are helping in using those materials which are less toxic. So generational decisions make economic decisions based on long term consequences. So we need to understand what is the significance of plastic materials, how they are going to have leave their impact on environment, what is their relationship with the business parameters. So we must have a intermediate decision whether to promote business or to promote health. So target welfare, not GDP. So that's the only way to have a sustainable development. Value measures of economic and social welfare more than GDP. So global initiatives, a set of international standards which bring worldwide focus on the environment, encourage a cleaner, safer, healthier world, for all of us. So energy saving plans and water wastewater management plans, solid waste management plan, emergency management plan, recycle management plan, all these are the global level issues which we need to deal on global level. Similarly, we have a series of ISO 14000, which is responsible for developing international standards of environment. So we have EMS, environmental management series, and environmental auditing, environmental labeling, environmental performance evaluation, life cycle assessment, etc. There are so many. So here are some of the examples. What does the ISO 14000 series cover? So these are the examples which you can go through. 14000 is about guide to environmental management principles, systems, supporting techniques. 14001 is about environmental management systems, and 14010 about guidelines for environmental auditing. So there are so many examples for that. So here is the kind of summary once again: environmental planning, management, and follow up. So while we are planning, we are considering our policy. Then we are developing our strategic plan. Then their strategy is going to be shifted about the management, and we need some approvals to implement all these things. So this is something which we are going to do for environmental planning. And for management, we need implement approval conditions, implementing management plan action, day to day reactive actions, all these things about the management. First of all, we planned, then now we are managing only for the implementation. After the implementation, we need to have a follow up, whether there are positive response or we are having a negative response. That is based on the checking is related to the monitoring and evaluation. So environmental monitoring will be conducted, checking will be conducted, and then we will learn out whether it is positive or not. And then if it is positive, it will be continued. If it is negative, we need to revise, we need to go back to the planning, we need to revise the policy, we need to have a revised strategic plan, a revised management plan, and then again we will be continuing. So it is all the same thing, we are again repeating, and then it is again a summary. So starting from the environmental strategies, moving to the environmental policies, then we have policy implementation instruments or tools which are here, and then resulting into the environmental sustainability and protection. So that's all for our today's lecture. Thank you very much.